Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is something which I think is quite difficult for Resident Evil fans to listen to, but I think it really needs to be done. I am going to attempt the unpopular action of defending the Resident Evil movies made by our good friend Paul Anderson. He's not liked by a lot of Resident Evil fans, primarily for the simple crime that out of the 5 movies he made, was it 6? I can't remember. 6 Resident Evil movies that he made. Most of them have nothing to do with Resident Evil. And are the 8 games and various spin-offs that are out there. And the simple accusation has been, oh, he's not a fan of the games, he didn't like the games, he didn't know what he was doing, he just did a cheap Resident Evil in name only, generic action movies. It was just a vehicle for his wife, yada yada yada. I actually don't think that's true, and I don't think it's true for quite complicated reasons. Because doing a bit of research into the origin of the Resident Evil movies, for me, is quite fascinating, because you have a simple premise, turning a game into a movie, and it has been extremely difficult for the Hollywood machine to do this. The recent, well, I say recent, a few years ago, the what's it called? Welcome to Raccoon City. That was essentially regarded as a failure by the fan base, as a faithful adaptation. It failed on many levels. The series with the Wesker daughters, what is it? It doesn't even look like Resident Evil. It's not even, to call it Resident Evil in name only is an insult to the name of Resident Evil. It's sort of weird post-apocalyptic sci-fi with some zombies knocking around. I don't know what the hell it is, but you see the point. It's for some strange reason, Hollywood and media in general has a real problem with Resident Evil. If it can't make a faithful adaptation with 7 films and a TV series, you could argue that the CGI movies are probably it's a different league, but the live action movies are essentially all failed adaptations, and that to me is fascinating, because it demonstrates that there is a very deep problem, either with the source material or with the industry as a whole. And working backwards from how the Resident Evil Paul's movies got made, I think I found out what went wrong and why it was almost doomed from the start that he couldn't have made a good Resident Evil adaptation. What I have done is I've designed a chart to make it all as simple as possible as I can. Otherwise, it's just me reading from a script, which no one likes, because it's dull and boring. So I'll start at the beginning. Event Horizon. Event Horizon is essentially Paul Anderson's homage to Alien, because it's the haunted house in space. That's what Alien is. It changes the xenomorph for what you call it, the weird hell dimension Hellraiser type thing. But it's essentially Alien space, and it's probably the best not a rip-off, but homage, cousin, whatever you call it, of Alien Out, because there have been some rather appalling attempted rip-offs of Alien, and they've all failed. But this is the only one that's really succeeded, and it's a good movie. It's a solid, respectable film. High quality, good cast, script ain't too bad, premise ain't too bad. It's aged very well. So that, I think, it is where it starts, and it demonstrates that Paul is not a bad director. He's not an amazing director. I think even he would agree with that. He's a competent director. He's a solid director. He knows his craft. He knows his trade, and he's made some very successful films. and he's made some films that are respectable. So I'm not just to say that he's a bad director is, I think, an unwarranted attack. So the story goes is that one fateful day, Paul starts to play Resident Evil 1 and falls in love with the game. He becomes a fan. He wants to do an adaptation of this because he'd done an adaptation of Mortal Kombat, which was a fun, successful adaptation, made a lot of money. It's still loved to this day. It's a fun, innocent piece of entertainment. There's nothing deep about it. It's you know it's a Friday night, Saturday night movie. So he plays Resident Evil. He, at the time that he wrote this, didn't think that he could ever get the rights to it. So he decides to do a not an adaptation, but an inspiration movie, which he called The Undead. So it was inspired by Resident Evil, but not based on a Resident Evil game. And this is a very, very interesting point that other people have picked up. The link is below. The similarities between the plot structure of Resident Evil 1 and Alien 2 are remarkable. I am not saying he committed not fraud, intellectual theft. He was inspired by it. And that's a good film to be inspired by, because Alien 2 is regarded as one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made, certainly one of the greatest sequels ever made, and one of Jim Cameron's best films. So he was learning from the best. He's an Alien 2 fanboy, just as he's an Alien 1 fanboy, which is why Event Horizon was made. It's his version of Alien. So he has the Alien 2 plot structure, and he develops this character called Alice as the strong female lead. Similarities to Ripley, more or less. But the very interesting thing is that he gives her amnesia, so she has no past, which I think is quite a clever way of not having to flesh out your character, because her entire motivation for being is discovering her past, and because of the flawed nature of human memory, you can have all sorts of fun with her remembering things out of order or remembering things incorrectly and all the rest of it. So we have we have Resident Evil 1. It's by them called The Undead. He then gets permission from Capcom to do a Resident Evil movie, but this is the crucial point, and this is kind of folklore, so I'm not 100% sure that it's true. But the agreement was that yes, you can make a movie called Resident Evil, but it cannot be based on any existing Resident Evil game. That really sealed the fate of his whole franchise in being a faithful adaptation of the game. It was over. So he has a script for Undead. He then gives it a superficial gloss. I term it here as a late stage gloss. This is what this red outline means. It's like a layer of paint over the story. Just for point of view, the picture of the woman represents the girl, and the picture of the gun represents the gun. The girl is the character, and the gun is the plot. So that they join together to make a movie. His Undead script, which was not really a Resident Evil movie, gets a superficial late stage gloss to make it Resident Evil. So there's a few points in the Spencer Mansion, the character called Spencer, Umbrella, but really it's its own thing. The movie comes out, and it does rather well. Somewhere the relationship between him and Capcom changed to where he could do an adaptation of an existing Resident Evil game. And this is where I think Paul really, really got stuck. Because in order to make a sequel to Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil Apocalypse, he is constricted by two things. Number one, he has to make a movie that is a sequel to his first movie, which really wasn't a Resident Evil movie in reality. It was an homage to Alien 2. And then he's also stuck with having to use its title character, Alice. And I think again, I can't prove this, but I think it is reasonable to believe that Milia Jovovich, I pronounce the name, was probably signed for multiple sequels to Resident Evil 1. And it was probably in the agreement that she obviously would have to star in the Resident Evil 2 and 3 or whatever, but she would have to be the same character. I think that's completely normal, that's completely sensible, that's an industry norm. So the brackets that he's got around him is that it has to be logically continuous to the plot from the first movie, which isn't really a Resident Evil movie, and it has to contain Alice, who is a complete innovation and insertion into the Resident Evil verse. So you can see the problems he's got. He can't go back to the mansion again. So his options are, because the way Resident Evil 1 ended, it's got to be a zombie movie in a city. His options are either Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 is the option because it's based running around a city. And if you look on the chart here, it's blended with the blue and the red. So it's essentially a continuation of his first film, but it has elements of Resident Evil 3 put in there. So that's the Jill Valentine, Carlos. You could argue that there's some borrowing from Resident Evil 2 in the relationship with the girl. I can't remember her name. But yeah, things of that nature. And if you look on the chart, he also tries to develop the Alice character by adding what I call the mother theme. So this is her relationship with that girl, the one who has to take injections. I can't remember her name. If anyone can, of course. And the super theme, which is where she starts, mutating and getting ultra strength and powers and whatnot, which we'll see later. So he is cranking everything he can within the limitations that are upon him, and that is really as close as he can get to a faithful adaptation on the framework that he's had, that he has inherited. Resident Evil 2 Apocalypse is as close as he could pull off to a faithful adaptation. And this is where things really, really break down after that, because I think Paul is a Resident Evil fan. But I think, like me and many others, he's a fan of the golden age Resident Evil games. The original survival horror trilogy of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, and probably Code Veronica as well. The action-adventure games that were created by and succeeded by Resident Evil 4, yes, they go back to survival horror in Resident Evil 7, are not survival horror. I think Paul lost interest in the Resident Evil series in the early 2000s with the advent of Resident Evil 4. And because of that, he thought the series is done. I'm going to do what the hell I like. Which is why in Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil Extinction, we have an almost a complete reboot. So I call it the Mad Max reboot because it's very similar to Mad Max. Paul a fan of Mad Max, probably. The desert wasteland and the convoy. And yes, we have, you see on the chart, superficial elements of Umbrella added into there. But also we have the addition of what I call the corporate war theme, which carries on for the rest of the series, that Alice and Umbrella are trying to kill each other, and she has to shut down Umbrella. Bit useless at that stage of the game because the world has already ended. If anything, you would need Umbrella because it has like that's not the point. So we have the reboot. And then after that, the next 3 movies, if you look here, I say that the yellow turns to a brownish color. That's a generic post-apocalypse environment, burnt out cities and, abandoned gas stations and that sort of thing. And this is the sort of formulaic cookie-cutter trilogy that he's now got, and it's done purely for money, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, it's a business, and they make a lot of money. The corporate war theme carries on. In Resident Evil Retribution, we have the mother theme reintroduced, where she's running around with that deaf girl who's a clone, who literally thinks she's her mum, but she's not a mum, she's another clone. Don't take my word for it, go watch it. It's the one where they're all they go back to the like the white picket fence and people from the first two films come back. Y'all know what I mean. And the last film, very interestingly, goes back to the first movie, and ironically completely rewrites the notion of the first movie by adding in this kind of eugenics theme, whatever you want to call it. And that's the end of it. Done and dusted. $1 billion in the bank. And they're quite stylish, fun, entertaining movies, which is what they were only ever intended to be. But you see my point. There is no real likelihood that Paul could have actually made a faithful Resident Evil 1 adaptation of people running around the mansion. His first story wasn't even a Resident Evil story. It became a Resident Evil story with a late gloss. The contractual obligations he had with its star and the plot limitations he had from it being a rational sequel to the first game meant that his authorized attempt at making a direct Resident Evil adaptation were hamstrung by this. He could only really use the Resident Evil 2 and 3 storylines, and even then, he couldn't have it Jill-centric because his lead is Alice, not Jill, which is a really weird, Jill's just sort of there. He tries to develop the character, which is fair enough with the mother theme and so on, but that's as good as he could do. And then he lost interest in Resident Evil altogether because Resident Evil had made a massive sort of right-hand drift over to action, which is all predominantly due to changes in video game in the industry at the time. And after that, because the films were financially successful, they just kept going. And he borrowed bits and pieces from, Resident Evil lore as and when it suited him. So there. So, dear old Paul Anderson, I don't think deserves half the criticism that the hardcore fan base gives him, because of it's really the nature of the industry and the nature of Capcom. He was screwed from the beginning, really. And he didn't really know, I think, how screwed he was until he had the opportunity to make a pure adaptation, and he couldn't do it because the legacy he had inherited from his own first movie caused too many restrictions. And then he lost interest altogether. So there. If Paul had had the ability to make a pure Resident Evil adaptation, if Capcom had given him a free hand from day one, and if he wasn't the Alien 2 fanboy, so he actually did he made the movie that the game suggested rather than the movie he wanted to make, I think it would look a Paul Anderson real adaptation of Resident Evil 1, I think would look a lot like Event Horizon. Because Event Horizon is a sci-fi haunted house movie. And Resident Evil 1 is a sci-fi haunted house game. I think it would look in a parallel universe. It would his real Resident Evil movie would be a lot like Event Horizon. Team of heroes go to a distant location. They find it's all screwed up. It's a trap. There's a betrayal. Half of them get killed, or all but one gets killed. They bail out of there, and the thing blows up. In the last 5 minutes. It's quite similar to Resident Evil, although that's a generic action plot. So I think in terms of tone, set design, which is very good to Event Horizon, I think Event Horizon is very bloody. I think that would have been in his RE1 adaptation. So just sort of visualize what Event Horizon would be if it was a Resident Evil movie. That's what I think it probably would have appeared like.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It's a small thing, but it really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to help us in a one-off and easy way, you can buy us a coffee at the link below. Thank you.